I'm not really a photographer. I take pictures, but the most important part of my job is to connect with people. I tune into their frequency and I document what I find on film. And it's only 1/500th of a second. It's not even a second. But I can create a moment of pause that gives us a moment of reflection.
Él es Platon Antoniou, conocido artísticamente solo como Platón. Seguramente identificarán muchos de sus retratos ya que ha fotografiado algunas de las personas más reconocidas del planeta. Además de que su trabajo ha sido publicado en muchas revistas y tiene el récord de haber fotografiado al mayor número de líderes mundiales, entre los cuales hay varios dictadores.
My job is to make human contact in the worst circumstances every time. If I'm photographing someone of great power and authority, I'm not a priority for them normally. They're very busy people, so I'm given very little time. When you concentrate on that moment and you invest your whole being into that moment, you just need a few seconds. With Hugo Chavez, I had 30 seconds. It's the shortest shoot I ever had, and I got one frame. But he understood, and I understood, that this is a moment of history, and he gave me his personality on a plate. So I only needed one picture. That was enough. It was plenty. You know, we are all being pushed into a position where we are frightened to be authentic, especially in our jobs. But it's now permeating all sides of life. Social media is not real. Everyone is acting most of the time. Authenticity is something that is so needed right now. When I photographed Adele, for instance, she had just had a baby and she didn't want to leave her baby to promote her new album. So she brought her baby to the photo session. She gently placed her baby on the floor between us while I'm getting ready to take the picture. And suddenly, the little baby starts to squeeze her ankle. And as I'm focusing on her eyelash, she feels the pressure on her foot. And it completely changes the dynamic. Suddenly, she's not one of the world's greatest pop stars. She's a young mother. And she feels the pull to give attention to her, the most important thing in her life. And I caught that on film. And that's why the picture of Adele is so powerful. It's because she's being authentic. I've always been fascinated by power and leadership. Maybe because I'm immune to it. And I can't think of a place in the world that draws the most powerful people in the world to one tiny spot on the planet. And that's the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I could photograph every head of state and government at the UN one year? No one has ever done it because it's virtually impossible. I had over 90 meetings to win trust at the United Nations. Security, protocol, press offices, it went on and on forever. But you know, I'm determined. Eventually I got allowed and I built a small studio just outside the green room where every head of state and government goes to rehearse their speech before they walk on stage at the UN to address the assembly. And at the beginning, no one would sit for me. Of course, once one person starts, it begins its tipping point. And after a day and a half, it turned the other way around, that it became almost a private members club that many people wanted to be included. And we had governments and assistants coming up to us saying, chief of staff saying, excuse me, we haven't been invited. Why is that? Can we pencil our president in for tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock? And at one point, there was a line of world leaders. Gaddafi was one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. I was surrounded by the White House administration, President Obama was making his first speech as President of the United States at the United Nations. He was seen at that moment as a political messiah by many people, and he was backstage rehearsing, about to go on, and suddenly this giant crowd swell appears, and it's the Libyan delegation. Gaddafi is marching in slow motion defiance in the middle of this group, surrounded by about 15 female bodyguards dressed head to foot in military clothing. It was like a scene from Star Wars. Now, this is a protocol nightmare. You're not allowed to have two opposing governments coming face to face without prior negotiations. And this was all my fault. So while the Secret Service from the American administration are starting to panic, Gaddafi marches right up to me and he whispers to me, "Mr. Platon, I have come for my first and only portrait on American soil, but I will do it now under the nose of the White House administration. I want them to watch." I pick up the camera, he sits in front of me, and defiance permeates my picture. And he's not really posing for me. He's posing for America to show that he will stand a lot longer than they think he will. It's a portrait of a, you could say, the soul of state-sponsored terrorism, defying the American administration. Well, I photographed George W. Bush just after he left office. I was told by his team that he's a great guy. He's chilling out now. We'll have great time together. I was really excited. So I went to Dallas and I set up my studio in W. Bush's office. But as the swing doors open and in walks W. Bush, I realized very quickly that this is not going to be fun at all. The first thing that happened is he came up to me with two fingers aggressively pointing into my chest, and he said, "You better be photographing a guy who's happy and not some kind of snarler. Get it?" Whoa. Now, does this mean he's a bully? I don't think so. What I think was happening is something completely different. I call it a transference of power, because now he's left the White House. He has something he did not have before: time. Time to reflect. And I suspect the last thing he wanted was to be documented forevermore in that vulnerable moment of reflection. So what does he do? He puts on this huge smile in every frame I take, and I couldn't shake it. But sometimes the mask tells us more about the truth than the truth does. W. Bush came to office a big supporter of immigration. But when 9/11 happened, his stance on immigration took a hard turn. He instantly started to militarize the border, leaving only the most dangerous areas in the Saharan desert, assuming that this would be a deterrent for people. But I suspect that his administration underestimated the desperation of people. And the same amount of people were now all funneling through the most dangerous parts of the border. Consequently, deaths soared at the border. And this was really the beginning of a giant crisis emerging. Just a few years later, I was invited by Time magazine to do the first presidential type of portrait of a new candidate. Barack Obama, who was now senator for Chicago, had just announced, maybe 25 minutes before, that he was going to run for president. And I was there to photograph him at the beginning of his journey all the way to the top of the power pyramid. I remember being in his office and I said to him, "You know, Senator, my mum thinks you're fantastic and she hopes you make it to the White House. But all her friends and neighbours in London tell her that your chances are very, very slim. he leaned forward and he said, "Tell your mama I said hi." It's so fantastically American. And I took a color picture of him at that moment with his arms folded, and that human connection brought out that extraordinary capacity that Obama had to inspire hope in people. There's an optimism in that picture, there's a dignity, there's a grace, but that's not necessarily the whole Obama for me. He's much more cautious than we all expected as a president. From that early charismatic presidential campaign, as president, he was much more cautious. Obama gets elected. He does do some interesting things with regard to immigration. He created DACA, the Dreamers Act. He helped maybe 800,000 people, I believe, who were brought to the US as children. He gave them some type of protection. But he also oversaw mass deportations. He actually deported, I believe the numbers are something like 3 million people. And in the end, did he fix meaningful immigration reform? No, he did not.
Platón empezó a cubrir la crisis migratoria durante la era Obama en un momento en el que él consideraba que el Congreso estadounidense no le daba al tema la importancia que tenía.
I knew that immigration is a massive problem. It's a crisis brewing under the surface. I was seeing families torn apart. I was seeing people dying at the border. And I had a feeling, if we don't talk about this emerging crisis, then someone is going to come along very soon and harness this crisis and use it as political currency because people have neglected to deal with it. And that person was Donald Trump. We all remember Donald Trump's very famous announcement that he's going to run for president. And it was in the lobby of Trump Tower, June 2015, I believe. And during his speech, he said, "They are sending us not the right people."
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Now, that's a very different type of narrative. But he definitely harnessed the crisis, but he came along. I photographed him a few floors up from the lobby where he made this very powerful speech. It was in the boardroom in Trump Tower in his office complex. He walked in the room and he was very charming. He was very charismatic. He sat in front of my camera and I asked him to look straight into the lens, the way all my subjects do, very symmetrical. And he said, "Oh, no, no, no. That's not how we do this." So I said, "How do we do this?" And he turns sideways and he says, "This is my best side." What does that tell us about Donald Trump? It tells me that despite his battles with the media, I think secretly he loves the media. I think he thinks of the media as his greatest instrument, sometimes even a weapon. Of all the politicians I've had the privilege to work with, not one of them has ever said to me, "This is my best side, take it." Instead, they're all nervous, they're all insecure that I might accidentally catch their worst side. You know, we're all the same. We all love and we all get to lose. That's what life is. You can't avoid loss. And if you're lucky enough to have experienced love, then you've lived a full life. And the migrants that I've had the privilege to work with all have families. They're driven by a hope for a decent life, but mostly they just want to be together. The picture I took of the border is it's a pointless wall. It runs into the sea. It's like trying to hold back the waves. It's impossible. And as I took this picture on the Mexican side of the border, There was a family that had just had a picnic on the sand, and it was getting dark, and they were walking back to their car. And I just saw the communal feeling of the family just doing a normal thing, having a nice picnic, hanging out with their children. Life is a normal life. And yet just behind them, there's this giant wall going aimlessly into the sea. It reflected to me the hopelessness of this immigration crisis that's not just happening on the border between the US and Mexico, it's happening all around the world. This picture is one of the most dark moments of my life. I stood in a room in the morgue, surrounded by over 300 bodies of mostly women and children and some men. And all of them had died crossing the desert. When you die in the desert, it's so hot that within an hour, your body starts to decompose, and within 2 hours, you're unrecognizable. So what happens to all these people's humanity when they pass away? They go missing. And at this morgue, they started a missing migrants program where they would collect all the personal artifacts that people had on their body, a wallet, a comb, some family pictures, a rosary, and they collect them in little plastic bags. And then they can contact families who have had loved ones who just disappeared without any knowledge of what happened to them, and give them a sense of tragic closure.
Platón narra que quizá uno de los episodios más memorables en sus más de 30 años de carrera se dio en 2007 cuando la revista Time le pidió que volara a Rusia a fotografiar a Vladimir Putin, quien sería nombrado Persona del Año. 17 años después, el liderazgo de Putin y sus políticas continúan generando debate y controversia en la política internacional.
So one day, cold day in December, I was picked up from my Moscow hotel room, driven through the streets of Moscow in a former KGB BMW. And as we got to the gates, the agent who was a driver suddenly turned the wheel and turned the car and sped out in the opposite direction, away from the Kremlin, out of the streets of Moscow into a dark, bleak, Gothic forest. I thought my time was up. We arrived at the most sinister building I've ever seen in my life. It's his private residence, his private dacha in the middle of the forest. It's surrounded by a 2-story high security wall with snipers all the way along the top. And as I get out of the limo, I'm led into the building at gunpoint. I'm led into a room that's very historic. I was told that this is the room where they dissolved parts of the Soviet Union, and now it's Putin's office. I wait, the doors open, and in comes a giant entourage. He has 2 translators who whisper in his ear. He has a whole team of political advisors and a whole gang of bodyguards. I nervously said to him, "Mr. President, before I capture this moment of history, I've got a question I'd like to ask you. I was brought up by my parents. My mum and dad always listened to the music of the Beatles. And I would like to know if you ever liked the Beatles." They translate in his ear. There's some confusing looks amongst the entourage. And then his mood drops, and in Russian he orders the 2 translators and all the political advisors out of the room immediately. The bodyguards stay. And then Putin turns to me, and in perfect English he says, "I love the Beatles." I said, "I didn't know you spoke English." He said, "I speak perfect English." "Wow," I said, "in that case, who is your favorite Beatle?" He said, "Paul." I said, "Interesting. What's your favorite song? Is it Back in the USSR?" He did not like that at all. And then he says, "No, my favorite song is Yesterday." Now that connection I had with him allowed me in. I ended up 1.5 inches away from his nose as I took that picture. I could feel his cold breath on my hand as I focused the lens, and that's how I got the truth The truth is that this is the face of power and authority in Russia. And then he performed power for me in his chair.
¿Y aún hay personajes que no haya podido retratar en su lista de deseos?
I never got Queen Elizabeth. I'm devastated that I never got her. I've wanted to photograph Paul McCartney all my life. My son's name is Jude. My dog's name is Sergeant Pepper. And I've spoken to more world leaders about Beatles lyrics than anyone in history. And I still have not photographed Paul McCartney. If someone can help me get Paul McCartney, I will retire like that.